years old, and just a few months ago, she sold the last property her father had left behind for $20 million. The deal closed in a quiet office in Chicago. Just another transaction on paper. But the moment she walked out, something happened that didn't feel right. Her best friend stopped her, looked straight at her, and said something that made no sense at all. When your family asks about the money, tell them. The bank took everything. Tell them you ended up with nothing. She stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. But his face didn't change. There was no hesitation, no smile, just a quiet certainty that made the words land heavier than they should have. Why would she lie about something like that? He didn't explain. He just told her to trust him. And somehow, she did. What happened after that didn't just change how she saw her family. It forced her to face something that had been there for years, something she had ignored for far too long. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, I want to ask you something. Right now, wherever you are, tell me what time it is and what city you're watching from, so I know how far this story has reached. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. A few months earlier, things had already begun to move in a direction. Audrey Bennett didn't fully question at the time. Growing up in that house had never been simple for her, not in the quiet way people often imagined when they heard the word family, because from an early age, there had always been a clear difference in how she was seen, compared to her older sister, Lillian Bennett, who seemed to move through life with an ease. Audrey was never given. Lillian was the one praised at dinners, the one their mother, Janet Bennett, spoke about with pride in front of relatives, while Audrey was usually the one being corrected, reminded to try harder, or told she wasn't living up to expectations that were never clearly defined. It didn't happen in loud arguments or dramatic scenes. It was smaller than that, constant enough to settle into something permanent, shaping the way Audrey saw herself long before she ever left that house. When Richard Cole entered their lives, things didn't improve. They shifted into something colder, more controlled, where decisions were discussed around her, but rarely with her, and where Lillian's opinion seemed to carry more weight than anyone else's. By the time Audrey reached her late 20s, she stopped, trying to fit into a space that had never truly made room for her. And she left without creating a scene, building a life on her own, keeping her distance for nearly 5 years, while the rest of the family continued, as if that distance had always been there. Then her father's property changed everything, not emotionally at first, but practically, because she was the only one named in the documents, the only one legally responsible for what had been left behind. An aging industrial site on the outskirts of Chicago that required constant maintenance and came with rising taxes no one else wanted to deal with. That was when the calls started again, first from her mother, gentle and familiar, asking how she was doing, then from Lillian, unusually interested in details she had never cared about before, and eventually from Richard, whose questions were always framed as concern but focused on numbers, timelines, and what she planned to do with the property at first. Audrey didn't think much of it. It felt like a reconnection, something that maybe should have happened years ago, but there were moments that didn't sit right. Like the way Richard would pause before asking about potential buyers, or how Lillian would casually mention investment ideas without waiting for an answer. Even Thomas Green, the lawyer handling the paperwork, had asked her during one meeting if anyone else in the family had been reaching out about the property. A question that seemed routine on the surface, but lingered longer than it should have after she left his office. Still, Audrey kept moving forward, focusing on closing the deal, telling herself that whatever had been broken in the past didn't need to define what was happening now, even if something beneath all of it felt slightly off in a way she couldn't yet explain. That afternoon, after they signing the final documents, Audrey Bennett stepped out of the building into the cold Chicago air, holding a folder that marked the end of something she had carried for longer than she realized. The process had taken months, filled with negotiations, legal reviews, and long meetings that stretched late into the evening. But in the end, everything came down to a few signatures across a polished table, a quiet exchange of documents, and a number that still felt unreal even after it was confirmed in writing. The industrial property her father had left behind was officially gone, transferred to new ownership for $20 million. And for a brief moment, there was a sense of relief that settled in, not excitement, not even satisfaction, just the absence of pressure that had been constant for so long. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching people pass by without noticing her, then reached for her phone and called the one person who had been present through every step of the process, Caleb Foster. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady, asking a simple question before anything else, whether it was done, and when she confirmed it, "Mbilibi." There was a short pause on the line that felt deliberate, as if he was choosing what to say next. He didn't react with surprise or excitement. He didn't ask about the details. Instead, he said that her father would have respected the decision, a response that felt grounded in a way she appreciated, because it didn't try to turn the moment into something it wasn't. They spoke briefly about the closing, about how long it had taken to reach that point, about the paperwork finally being out of her hands, but then his tone shifted, not abruptly, just enough for her to notice that the conversation was moving somewhere else. He said there was something she needed to do before telling anyone in her family. And when she asked what he meant, he didn't hesitate. He told her that when they asked about the money, she should say there was nothing left after everything was settled. She stopped walking, the words not fully registering at first, because they didn't fit into anything she had been expecting to hear. And when she asked him to explain, he repeated it, calmly, without adding anything that would make it easier to understand. For a moment, she thought he was trying to make a point about privacy, about keeping things quiet. But that wasn't what he was saying. He was asking her to lie, directly and completely, about something that would inevitably come up the moment she saw them. She told him it didn't make sense, that there was no reason to create a story that complicated something so straightforward. And he agreed that it sounded unreasonable, but he didn't change his position. Instead, he asked her to trust him, not in a vague way, but in the same tone he had used in moments before, when things had mattered more than they seemed at the time. Audrey stood there longer than she realized, the city moving around her while the conversation stayed, suspended in place. Because Caleb had never asked something like that before, not without a clear explanation. And yet, there was something in the way he said it that made it difficult to dismiss. Eventually, she let out a quiet breath and said she would do it, not because she understood the reason, but because she trusted the pattern of his judgment more than the confusion she was feeling in that moment. And when the call ended, she looked down at her phone for a second, as if expecting something else to follow. But there was nothing, just the next step waiting for her, which was driving across the city to a house she hadn't spent much time in until recently, carrying a version of the truth that didn't match reality at all. That evening, she pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The house looked the same as it always had, lights on, familiar silhouettes moving behind the windows, but the feeling wasn't the same. There was a tension she couldn't quite place. Something subtle that made her pause before stepping out and closing the door behind her. When she walked in, Janet was the first to greet her, moving quickly from the kitchen with a smile that felt warmer than usual, as if nothing had ever been distant between them. While Lillian was already seated at the table, leaning forward slightly, watching her with a kind of focus that hadn't been there in years, Richard stood near the counter, arms relaxed, observing without speaking at first. The kind of quiet presence that made it clear he was paying attention to every detail. The conversation started easily, almost too easily, with questions about her day, about how the process had gone, about whether everything had finally been resolved, and for a brief second, it felt like she had stepped into a version of the past that had been rewritten, one where the distance between them had never existed. Then the questions became more direct, not aggressive, but precise, and she knew this was the moment she had already agreed to face. She took a breath, keeping her voice steady, and said the deal hadn't gone the way they expected, that there had been complications, that after everything was settled, there was almost nothing left. The shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a current in the room changing direction without warning. Janet's expression didn't disappear, but it softened into something less certain, as if she was trying to understand what that meant without asking too quickly, while Lillian leaned back slightly, the interest in her posture fading in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. Richard was the first to respond, asking for clarification, not with concern, but with a tone that suggested he was measuring the situation rather than reacting to it. Audrey explained just enough to make the story hold, mentioning fees, unexpected claims, things that sounded reasonable when said calmly, even if they weren't real. And for a moment, no one interrupted her. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument could have, because it wasn't confusion, it was calculation, each of them processing the same information in their own way. Lillian reached for her phone without saying anything, her attention shifting elsewhere, as if the conversation had already lost its importance, while Janet sat back, her hands resting in her lap, looking at Audrey in a way that felt distant, like she was seeing her differently without fully showing it. Richard gave a short nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and said it was unfortunate, the kind of statement that closed the topic rather than opening it. The rest of the evening moved forward, but not in the way it had started. The energy in the room no longer aligned. Conversations drifting into unrelated topics, no one returning to what had just been said, as if it had already been decided that there was nothing more to discuss. When Audrey left later that night, the air outside felt colder than before, not because of the weather, but because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone, even if no one had spoken it out loud. Over the following weeks, the shift didn't arrive all at once, but it settled in quietly until it became impossible for Audrey Bennett to ignore. The calls that had briefly returned started to thin out, first becoming shorter, then less frequent, until they stopped altogether without any clear reason given, replaced by a distance that felt deliberate rather than accidental. When she did reach out, Janet's responses were polite but distracted, as if her attention was always somewhere else, while Lillian answered with a tone that carried a subtle edge, no longer pretending to be interested in anything Audrey had to say. It wasn't open hostility, not yet, but there was a noticeable change in how conversations ended, how quickly they moved on, how little effort was made to keep any connection going. Then the comments began, small at first, almost casual, the kind of remarks that could be dismissed if taken individually. But together, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Lillian mentioned during one conversation that some people weren't cut out for handling large responsibilities, saying it lightly, without directing it at anyone, but still looking straight at Audrey when she said it. On another occasion, Richard spoke about financial decisions in a general sense, emphasizing how important it was to think long-term, to avoid mistakes that couldn't be reversed, framing it as advice while making it clear who he believed had failed to meet that standard. Audrey didn't respond to those moments directly, not because she didn't notice them, but because reacting would have turned something implied into something explicit, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. Instead, she focused on her own work, keeping her routine steady, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, even as the tone around her continued to shift. One afternoon, she received a message from Thomas Green, asking if she had a few minutes to discuss something related to the property. And although the sale had already been completed, his request carried enough weight that she agreed to meet him at his office later that day. When she arrived, the conversation didn't begin with formalities. He went straight to the point, asking whether anyone in her family had contacted him recently about the property or about her financial position. The question caught her off guard, not because it was impossible, but because she hadn't expected it to come from him, and when she asked why he was bringing it up, he explained that he had received indirect inquiries. Nothing official, nothing that violated confidentiality, but enough to suggest that someone had been trying to understand how the ownership had been structured and whether there were any ways to influence the outcome. He didn't name anyone. And he didn't speculate. He simply presented what he had observed, leaving the interpretation to her. Audrey sat there for a moment, processing what he had said, connecting it with the conversations she had been having. Over the past few weeks, the questions that had seemed casual at the time, the way certain topics kept coming up without clear purpose. It didn't immediately change how she felt, but it introduced a possibility she hadn't fully considered before, one that didn't fit with the version of events she had been telling herself. When she left the office, the city felt different, not in a visible way, but in the way her attention shifted, noticing details she might have overlooked before, replaying conversations in her mind, hearing them with a different perspective. Later that evening, she ran into Lillian near a cafe, not far from where her sister worked, and what started as a brief exchange quickly turned into something sharper. Lillian commenting that it must be difficult to rebuild after losing something that's significant, not asking how Audrey was doing, not offering support, just stating it as if it were an established fact. Audrey replied calmly, pointing out that not everything had been within her control, but Lillian dismissed that explanation with a slight shrug, saying that responsibility didn't disappear just because circumstances were complicated. The conversation didn't last long after that, but it didn't need to, because the tone had already made everything clear in a way that didn't require further discussion. One night, the tension finally surfaced in a way Audrey Bennett could no longer avoid. The message from Janet had been brief, asking her to come over because Richard wanted to discuss something important. And although the wording sounded neutral, there was a weight behind it that made the request feel less like an invitation and more like a decision that had already been made. When she arrived, the atmosphere inside the house felt different immediately, not loud or chaotic, but tightly controlled, as if everyone had already settled into their positions before she walked through the door. Jeanette was seated on the couch, her hands folded together, avoiding direct eye contact, while Lillian stood near the window, arms crossed, watching without speaking, and Richard remained near the center of the room, his posture steady, waiting for her to take a seat before saying anything. Audrey moved forward, slowly, choosing the chair across from them, aware that whatever this was, it had been building for longer than anyone had admitted out loud. Richard began the conversation without hesitation, stating that they had been reviewing the situation, and that it raised concerns about her ability to manage long-term stability, framing it as a practical issue rather than a personal one, even though the implication was clear from the start. Gart. Audrey responded calmly, saying she had already handled everything that needed to be handled, but he dismissed that with a slight shake of his head, explaining that outcomes mattered more than effort and that the result spoke for itself. Lillian stepped in at that point, her tone sharper than before, saying that losing something that valuable couldn't simply be explained away. That responsibility didn't disappear just because circumstances were complicated, reinforcing what Richard had already suggested, but with less restraint. Audrey felt the shift in the conversation, not just in what was being said, but in how it was being delivered, as if the goal was no longer to understand, but to establish a conclusion that had already been agreed upon. She told them she wasn't asking for anything, that she was managing her own situation. But Richard responded with a quiet laugh that didn't carry humor, saying that dependence didn't always begin with a request. Sometimes it started with poor decisions that led to consequences. Others were expected to absorb. The words landed with a precision that made their meaning impossible to misinterpret. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm that this was no longer a discussion. Audrey looked at Janet, waiting for some kind of response, some sign that this wasn't as one-sided as it felt. But Janet kept her gaze lowered, offering nothing that would interrupt what was happening. Then Richard said it clearly, without raising his voice, explaining that the house couldn't become a place where instability was brought in, that it was better for everyone if boundaries were maintained, and that it would be best for Audrey to find her own space moving forward. Lillian didn't object, didn't soften the statement. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if agreeing with something that had already been obvious for a while. Audrey stood there for a second, absorbing what had just been said, recognizing that there was nothing left to argue, because the decision had already been made before she arrived. She didn't respond with anger, didn't try to change their minds. She simply nodded once, turned toward the door, and walked out without looking back, leaving the conversations exactly where they had placed it, unfinished but final in every way that mattered. Later that night, sitting across from Caleb Foster, the silence between them carried more weight than anything Audrey Bennett had experienced before. He didn't start with an apology or an explanation. He simply asked how it went, and when she told him what had happened, he nodded once, as if the outcome had followed a pattern he had already seen long before she did. There was no satisfaction in his reaction, only confirmation, and after a moment, he finally explained why he had asked her to say. There was nothing left from the sale. A few weeks before everything was finalized, he had overheard a conversation involving Richard and Lillian, not directly, but clearly enough to understand the intention behind it, discussing what would happen once the property was converted into cash, assuming Audrey would rely on them for guidance, and, more importantly, assuming they would have influence over how that money was handled. It hadn't been framed as a request. It had been discussed like a plan, something already expected to happen, with details that went beyond casual curiosity. Audrey listened without interrupting, each piece of information aligning with moments she had dismissed before. Conversations that now carried a different meaning when seen from that perspective. The next day, she contacted Thomas Green again, not to reopen anything legally, but to confirm whether anyone had attempted to position themselves around her financial decisions. And while he remained careful with his wording, he acknowledged that inquiries had been made in ways that suggested more than simple concern, reinforcing what Caleb had already told her. A few weeks later, a formal gathering was held to honor her father, bringing together relatives, old acquaintances, and people who had known him through different stages of his life. And it created the kind of setting where appearances mattered more than honesty. Audrey attended without hesitation, not to revisit anything, but to close something that had remained unresolved. Toward the end of the evening, when attention shifted and conversations quieted, she stepped forward and spoke clearly, not raising her voice, not creating a scene, simply correcting a version of events that had been accepted without question. She stated that the property had been sold for $20 million, that there had been no financial collapse, and that what followed had shown her exactly where she stood with the people she had once trusted. The reaction was immediate, not chaotic, but sharp, expressions changing, conversations stopping, the atmosphere shifting in a way that couldn't be contained once the truth was spoken aloud. Richard didn't respond, but the loss of control was visible in the way he held himself, while Lillian remained still, unable to reframe the situation in a way that protected the image she had relied on. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded in ways that were consistent with the world they lived in, not dramatic, but real. Business relationships distancing themselves from Richard as questions about his intentions circulated. Lillian facing setbacks in her professional environment where perception mattered. And Janet left navigating a space where silence no longer shielded her from the reality of what had been revealed. Audrey didn't engage with any of it. She didn't respond to messages, didn't revisit conversations. She moved forward without reopening anything that had already been decided. Cutting them off wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a conclusion reached after everything had been laid out clearly, and for the first time, there was no uncertainty attached to it. Some people believe that money changes relationships, but what Audrey understood in the end was simpler than that. It doesn't create anything new. It only exposes what was already there, and once you see that clearly, there's no reason